The day after Noah's funeral, my phone rang while I was still holding a paper cup that smelled of burnt coffee and lilies. The house hummed with small, careful sounds of grief. Plates touching lightly, a chair being folded, a door closing more gently than usual. I had been answering the same questions for hours. Where Noah had been working, whether he had mentioned feeling unwell. The screen lit up with Jonah's name. I stepped into the hallway between the coat rack and the shoe cabinet and answered before the second ring. He didn't say hello. I just got an email from him, he said. For a second, my mind rejected the sentence from the lawyer. I asked the bank. From Noah, he said. Hearing the way I went quiet. Timestamp is this morning. I pressed the cup against my chest so I wouldn't drop it. On the wall in front of me, a framed photo showed Noah as a teenager, mouth half open, about to laugh. A black ribbon slashed the frame corner, a punchline arriving too late. You're sure it's not something old that bounced back? I asked. No. The subject line says, you still owe me coffee. The thread is from last week, but this one is new. It says, see you at the usual place. M. His death certificate was signed last night. There is no way he wrote this. Someone called my name from the living room. I turned toward the wall and lowered my voice. Forward it to me, I said. And please don't show it to his mum yet. Not until I figure out what it is. Okay, he said. I'll send it now. We hung up. For a moment I stayed there in the narrow hallway, phone in one hand, cup in the other, as if the air had thickened around me. I pocketed the phone, took a breath, then walked back into the living room. His mother sat on the edge of the sofa with a plate on her lap. The food had been pushed to one side, untouched. The noise in the room dropped half a notch when I came in. The way a crowd settles when they expect an announcement. Emma, she said, and her voice caught on the second syllable. Do you have a minute? I sat beside her. Up close, she looked older than she had at the hospital, as if each of the last 24 hours had taken a year. Her hands shook a little as she set the plate down on the coffee table. There is something we should give you, she said. Her sister, who had been hovering near the kitchen doorway, came over with a white envelope. My name was on it in Noah's handwriting, leaned slightly to the right, the way it always did when he wrote too fast. A yellow post-it clung to the front. Give to Emma if something happens. The words were simple. Seeing them in his handwriting was not. I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. I turned it over in my hands, searching for the shape of a letter. A card. Some sign. This was one of his elaborate jokes. The insert felt stiff. Not paper. Not a letter. Plastic. When he set up the new computer last year, his mother said he made a list. Accounts, passwords, things like that. He insisted on writing it down and leaving it with me. In case, he said. I told him he was being dramatic. She let out a small breath that tried to be a laugh and failed. He said, if something happens, give this one to Emma. She'll know what to do with it. Conversation around us dipped. People stacked plates more quietly. Someone turned the music down until it was only the outline of a song. My fingers traced the edge of the envelope. Heat crept up the back of my neck. You're sure you want me to have this? I asked. She nodded, like the decision had been made days ago. I don't understand much about his accounts, she said. Email. Cloud. All of that. The funeral home mentioned memorial pages. The lawyer talked about digital assets. Her mouth tightened around the phrase, I don't want strangers going through his messages. If there are things that should be private, you'll know. The memorial is tomorrow at 4. If you could clear whatever needs to be cleared before then. The envelope sat between us like a small, heavy verdict. Out of habit, I started to say I wasn't the right person, that maybe the executor should handle it. The sentences lined up in my head. Then I saw Noah's handwriting again. My name without a last initial, like there was only one Emma in his life. "Okay," I heard myself say. "I'll take care of it." The muscles in her shoulders dropped a fraction. She covered my hand with both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know this is a lot to ask." It was also too late to refuse. By the time I got back to my apartment, the funeral flowers were already starting to droop. Someone had sent a big arrangement of lilies and something small and purple. I had dropped them on the kitchen table that morning, still in the delivery paper. Now the petals were sweating under the plastic like they regretted the whole idea. Keys clattered on the wood next to them. I stood there for a moment, coat still on, bag heavy on my shoulder. The apartment was silent. Just the refrigerator humming in the corner and the sound of my own breath catching in my throat. The envelope in my bag felt heavy against my hip. I didn't take it out right away. Instead, I used every shield my brain offered. I hung my coat up. I rinsed 2 coffee cups that could have waited. I moved the flowers into a vase and cut the stems with a snap, like I was auditioning for a different, cleaner life. Only when there was nothing left to straighten did I sit down and pull the envelope onto the table. It was soft at the edges from being moved from drawer to drawer. My name was on the front in Noah's handwriting, slightly slanted, letters leaning on each other for support. For Emma, if something happens, seeing it in my own lighting, away from the smell of casserole and grief, made my throat close tight. I slid a finger under the flap. The paper tore with a sharp, dry sound. Inside, 1 folded sheet. The email address I knew by heart. A long, ugly password. I didn't. Underneath that, in smaller writing, "Don't let them make it boring." I wasn't sure if "them" meant his family or the memorial service. I wasn't sure what he thought I could do about any of it. I laid the paper next to my laptop. The machine whirred awake. A cold rectangle of light spilled over the table. My own inbox popped up first, cluttered with colored labels. I had the urge to stay there. Reply to a client. Reschedule a meeting. Anything shallow and safe. But the tab with his email provider waited in the bookmarks bar. I clicked. I typed his address from muscle memory. When the password field appeared, my fingers stopped. This was the last gate. The border between Noah as I knew him and Noah as the server knew him once I typed this. I could never again say I didn't know what he was hiding. I got up, filled a glass with water I didn't want, drank half, came back. Then I typed. The system paused. A little spinning wheel doing its dance. I waited for some administrator in another country to check a list and deny me entry. The screen shifted. Inbox. The layout was familiar enough that my hands knew where to go. Folders on the left, messages in the middle. But at the top, in a color too bright for the room, a banner stretched across the screen. This account will be converted to memorial status, and certain content may be auto-deleted in 24 hours. Next to the text, a small countdown clock ticked. 23:59:42. It made no sound, but it felt loud. A presence in the corner of my eye. Polite. Clean. No mention of the cemetery plot across town or the speech cards still folded in pockets. Just converted, and status like the account had simply changed jobs. I wanted to look away, but the point of a clock is that it doesn't care if you watch it. Beneath the banner, the inbox looked ordinary. Newsletters, shipping confirmations, work threads titled Q3 Roadmap, a string of messages between him and his mother titled Sunday Call. On the left, the folders glowed. Inbox. Starred. Sent. Drafts. Scheduled. The last one had a number next to it, in brackets. More than 0. Of course. Noah had always treated his inbox like a time machine, starring things for his future self. The idea that he'd scheduled things for a future that no longer existed made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to click the little X on the banner. The system refused. The clock stayed. Fine. I clicked on scheduled. The list popped up. Short. 4 items. All subject lines that sounded like someone talking to a stubborn roommate. Reminder. Book the damn checkup. Noah. Call Mum. No excuse. If you're reading this, congratulations. You're 40. If you're still here at 45. The last one sat at the bottom. Unsent. Thin as a promise. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. The timer in my peripheral vision ticked down. 23 hours and change. Under the grief. A sharp curiosity woke up. Not rubbernecking. Just a need to know how he had been arranging his life while I wasn't looking. Okay, I said to the empty room. I clicked the first reminder. The email opened like a door. Subject. Reminder. Book the damn checkup. Noah. The body was short. Hey, you said you'd call the clinic this week. This is you. Not your mother. Not Emma. 1 phone call. 10 minutes. Do it before you talk yourself out of it again. A link to a cardiology clinic sat below the text. He'd mentioned it once and joked it away. Too busy. Too dramatic. At the bottom, the system stamp said it was scheduled for 3 days after he died. I read it again. I didn't hear the font. I heard his voice. This is you. Not your mother. Not Emma. He knew exactly how we would sound. He had written us out of the script to take responsibility. And then he still hadn't gone. My hand found the edge of the table. I gripped it until the shaking stopped. I closed the email. The system popped me back to the list. Item 2. Call Mum. No excuse. Even shorter. Sunday. 6 p. M. Her time. No, sorry, I got caught up with work this week. Just call. Recurring event. Every second Sunday. A queue of intentions stretching into a future he would never reach. I pictured him setting these up, late at night, desk lamp on, telling himself this was how he would finally become the good son. I saw his mother's face at the funeral. She had talked about their calls, how they meant the world, how many had actually happened. How many were just calendar notifications in an empty room? I clicked the third email. Subject. If you're reading this, congratulations, you're 40. My own age. Sitting on the screen like an accusation. Hey, if this landed. It means you made it past Dad. That's not nothing. I stopped. I knew about his father. Heart attack. Young. It was the story Noah told at parties. But I hadn't known the exact number. I hadn't known it was lodged in his spine like a measuring stick. I forced myself to read on. I hope you're not treating 40 like a cliff. I hope you've booked a checkup without bullying yourself. I hope you took a week off that didn't involve answering emails from a couch. If we're lucky enough to have the same people around, I hope you've told them something real for once. Below that, a list. Quit the job that makes you grind your teeth. Go to that city. Learn the soup recipe. Start the book idea. Each item had a little empty square next to it. Unchecked. Waiting. He had turned his life into a feature list. It should have been funny. It wasn't. Grief is a sharp thing to swallow. The send date was set for his 40th birthday. A red warning flag sat next to it now. Delivery failed. Recipient inactive. I sat back. The chair groaned under my weight. I had been telling myself a story when Noah died suddenly, without warning. But this inbox told a different one. He hadn't been ignorant. He had been trying, almost booking, almost calling, almost saying something real. The part of me that wanted to defend him and the part that wanted to shake him stood in the same hallway in my chest. I backed out of the message. The last email in the list glanced off my skin. If you're still here at 45, I didn't open it. Not yet. 40 was too close. 45 was a room I didn't have clearance for. I highlighted the line, then let it go. The email stayed closed. I stood up. The apartment felt too small. I walked a loop. Kitchen. Hallway. Bedroom. Back. I picked up a sweater of his and moved it from one chair to another. A decision that wasn't a decision. On my desk, my own laptop chimed. A calendar notification on my screen said, "Call Mum, Sunday." I had typed that months ago. Unlike Noah's, mine wasn't automated. I saw it and dismissed it most weeks. I looked from his screen to mine. "I get it," I muttered. I grabbed a sticky note and wrote 3 words. Stuck it under his laptop. Health. Mum. Time. 3 clocks he'd tried to manage. 3 clocks I had been ignoring. The banner at the top of the screen shaved off another hour. 22 hours left. I didn't grab my phone and call my doctor. I didn't call my mother. I just stood there, in the smell of stale lilies, knowing I couldn't pretend ignorance anymore. I sat down. I hovered the cursor over. "If you're still here at 45 one more time, not your room," I whispered. I clicked back to the main inbox. Other sections waited. Drafts to strangers. Forwarded threads. And one unlabeled email to me with a subject line that made my chest tighten. "The thing about you, Emma." I didn't open that one either. One cliff at a time. For now, it was enough to know Noah had been planning for a version of himself that never arrived. The timer kept counting. Quiet. Relentless. "Okay," I told the screen. "We're not done." The drafts folder looked like a junk drawer spilled onto a screen. Subject lines half finished. Sentences that stopped mid-word. I told myself, skim. Don't read. Just sort. That was the deal. Look. Don't touch. Then my eye caught a name. Draft. To Sarah. Unsent. Again. I clicked. The window opened. No greeting. Just a line. Sitting there, like he had typed it, and walked away. I know we keep pretending this was mutual, but it wasn't. I keep rehearsing the wrong version in front of people we both still see. I leaned back. Sarah. The ex. The one who hugged me too long at parties. I scrolled. The cursor blinked in the middle of a paragraph. When you told them it had just run its course, I nodded. I let you keep that line because it made you look kind. The truth is, I was still buying groceries for 2 when you had already moved your favorite mug. The mug. Chipped blue ceramic. I'd seen it on her social feed next to a new grey couch. I had double-tapped it. Left a heart. A sour taste rose in my throat. Farther down he had written, "I'm not mad you left. I'm mad we keep editing the story in rooms where I'm supposed to just smile and refill the drinks." It was his voice. Not the party voice. The flat one. The one he used when the jokes ran out. I checked the corner of the screen. The timer slid down. 18 hours. There were more. Draft. Sarah. Don't send. Draft. Sarah. Take 3. I opened the next one. Softer this time. I hope you're well. I hope your dad's scan was clear. Our lives keep overlapping, like badly drawn Venn diagrams, and I keep wanting to fix the labels. Then, I keep wondering if I made it too easy. I made it a joke, so no one would have to sit in the silence between I'm fine and I'm not. My throat tightened. I thought about all the times I had told that story. They just outgrew each other. Noah nodding across the table. Team adult. Maybe we weren't. I scrolled to the bottom. No signature. Just a blinking cursor. I closed the draft. Pressed my palms over my face. Part of me wanted to defend him. You were allowed to be messy here. Part of me wanted to defend her. She was allowed to leave. Both parts sat in the narrow space behind my ribs. Pushing. I clicked back to the list. Other names? His brother. His boss. Me. Draft. Emma. The thing I didn't say. My hand hovered. Not yet. My chest was too crowded. I scrolled past. Opened another one to Sarah. One line. I hate that my friends keep telling a version of our story that makes me sound wiser than I was. I stared. I heard my own voice. Bright and practiced. He's doing great. They're both happier. We had said that in 3 different kitchens. On the screen. Noah sat between send and delete. These drafts were a holding pen. For the rageful Noah. The needy Noah. The one who wanted to scream. That's not how it went. He had built an echo chamber. Typed into it. Then went back to topping up drinks. Guilt pricked at me. Not clean guilt. Messy. Like something spilled and never wiped up. I had been grateful he kept it light. Grateful I didn't have to sit in the heavy version. I scrolled down. Bottom of the draft. Small sentences. I don't know if I want you to read this. I just want there to be a version of the night where I said what I meant. The cursor blinked. Patient. The apartment was quiet. The flowers bent in their vases. The radiator hissed. My coffee was cold. I thought of the timer. Not the one on the screen. The one in my head. How long do you have to tell the truth before the story hardens? I closed the Sarah drafts. The inbox shifted back to a grid. Rows of almost sent selves. I moved the cursor to the draft with my name. I didn't open it, but I knew I would. Soon. The draft with my name sat in the center of the list, like a coin at the bottom of a glass. Draft. About that night. Don't send. No greeting. No date. Just the subject. That night. Could be anything. The hospital. The breakup party. The painting night. But I knew. The kitchen light in my memory turned on before the text even loaded. I keep calling it the fun night. You do too. We tell the story like it was all laughter and dumplings. I'm writing this because I need a version where I don't edit out the part where I tried to tell you something and you laughed it away. My fingers gripped the edge of the laptop. He described it like a script. You came over with 2 bottles of wine. You put them on the counter. You said, "Good news." I finally cancelled my gym membership and I started chopping scallions. I saw it. The green bits sticking to the knife. I heard my own voice. Too loud. Filling the space. I said, I got the blood work back. And you said, okay, but first. Taste this. You held a piece of dough to my mouth. It tasted like flour and salt and comfort. I stopped. I got the blood work back. I read it again. In my memory, that night was a montage. Wine. Bad dancing. The dog video. I remembered him sitting on the floor, back against the dishwasher. I remembered sliding down next to him. I did not remember that line. I scrolled. When I said the blood work, you smiled like I had mentioned the weather. I tried again. I said, they want me to do more tests. You said, Doctors always want more tests. That's how they stay in business. I laughed too. It was easier. The words blurred. I blinked hard. The timer ticked. Auto-delete pending. Cheerful. Neutral. I don't blame you. I know what it costs to be the one who keeps the night fun. But part of me was testing you, seeing if you would notice that more tests meant what it usually means for men with my family history. Family history. His father. The heart attack at 20. The way Noah avoided gyms like they were haunted. The night rewound in my head. I saw us on the floor. Soy sauce on his jeans. He had leaned his head on my shoulder. I had laughed. Of course I had laughed. It was a good line. We kept the story safe. Remember when we almost set off the alarm? It is a better story for dinner parties. No one wants to hear, remember when I was scared, and we changed the subject. My hands went cold. We had told that story a dozen times. At barbecues. In taxis. We hit the same beats. The same punchlines. I'm not writing this to make you feel bad. But that night, I wanted to see if anyone would notice I was scared. You didn't. We built that room together. My throat closed. In the reflection, I saw my face. Older. Lined. Later, when the doctor said the thing I didn't want him to say, I thought about that night. I realized how well we trained each other not to hear the heavy parts. He had not sent this. He had never sent it. We kept telling the fun version until it turned to stone. The kitchen in my head shifted. The music dipped. The line about more tests slid forward, sharp and jagged. Guilt rose up. And recognition. How many times had I done the same? Buried the real sentence in a joke. I scrolled to the end. If you ever read this, I just want there to be a record that I was scared, and that I tried to hand that fear to someone. The cursor blinked. No sign-off. Just blank space. Outside, a car door slammed. My hands left the laptop, found my chest, pressed the heel of my palm between my ribs. That memory used to be light, fizzy, flour, dust, and wine. Now it had weight. I thought about the memorial tomorrow, the slideshow, the speeches. I pictured myself standing up. Do you remember the dumplings? He was terrified that night. I saw the room stiffen. I wasn't sure if I would do it. But here, on the screen, the heavy version existed. I hovered over the options. Send. Delete. Save. I didn't click. I remember now, I whispered. The words were small. Late. But real. The timer dropped another minute. I wondered if I could live with myself if I let this version disappear. If I wiped it clean. I closed the draft gently. For now. It stayed. The age 40 email took longer. On one level, it was pure Noah. Funny. Self-aware. List. Obsessed. Parts of it would have made his mother laugh. She would have clapped a hand to her chest and said, "Of course he wrote himself a birthday pep talk." He always talked to himself on paper, on another level. The joke sat on top of something harder. Under the bullet points and the little self-mocking asides, there was a tight thread of numbers, dates, ages, the year his father died, the exact gap between that age and 40, the way he had been counting up to it like weather reports. I read it line by line, the way I would read a manuscript that might fall apart if I skimmed. In my head, I could already hear the questions his sister would ask if she saw this. How long had he been worrying? Why hadn't he told us? Had we missed something obvious? 10 years from now, his nephews could pull this email into their own timelines. adding his numbers to whatever quiet fears they were already growing. It was not a neutral piece of text. It changed the room it entered. My shoulders had climbed up towards my ears. I rolled them back, one and then the other. The lilies on the table smelled stronger than they had an hour ago, sweet and a little sour at the edges. The laptop fan hummed steadily, a small, stubborn sound under the silence of the flat. On the screen, Noah's voice kept talking to a version of himself he had never reached. He thanked future Noah for booking the damn checkup, for not ghosting his own body. He wrote, "If you're reading this, congratulations, you didn't treat 40 like a cliff you fall off." The line twisted in my chest. In the email, it was a joke. Here, with his heart already stopped, it landed like a verdict. If I dropped this whole message into the memorial slideshow, people would cry in the wrong shape. They would see a man doomed by a date instead of a man who had tried, clumsily, to root for himself. In the end, I split the email in two. Click, drag, drop. The paragraph where he thanked himself for staying, for making the appointment, for calling his mother more often, moved into the memorial folder. That piece was honest without being raw. It showed his hope. It showed that he had imagined a future. The rest. The specific age his father had been. The nights he lay awake counting heartbeats. The line where he admitted he sometimes checked his pulse in the middle of meetings went into family only. Maybe, one day, they would want to see that version of him. They could decide then whether that knowledge helped or just moved the weight around. The folder labels glowed quietly in the sidebar, softer than they felt in my hands. I sat back for a second and noticed the way the room had shifted. The daylight had thinned into the cooler blue that meant late afternoon. A car passed outside, tires hissing on damp asphalt. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's radio played a saxophone line that sounded like someone trying not to cry too loudly. "If you're reading this, congratulations," I murmured, echoing his words to no one in particular. On my side of the table, my own age lurked like a number half erased on a whiteboard. Noah had built an entire pep talk around 40 and never got there. I had spent most of my 30s assuming I would get unlimited extensions. The timer in the corner of his screen ticked down another few minutes. I opened my notebook without thinking and found the page where I had scribbled after this project goals. Learn a language. Take a real vacation. Start that long-form piece I kept promising myself. The pen rested in the crease. Instead of adding another bullet point, I closed the notebook and opened a blank note window beside Noah's email. The cursor waited in the title bar. I typed 2 words. If I reach 40. Nothing beneath it. No list. No new promises. Just the phrase, sitting there with the cursor blinking after it like a held breath. It was a small, private act of defiance against the draftness of everything. Not a manifesto. A placeholder for a conversation with myself I might actually have on time. After a minute, habit 1. My fingers moved through the familiar shortcut to close the note. A dialog box popped up, asking if I wanted to save. For once, I hesitated. I clicked save. The note slipped into my own account with a soft confirmation sound. A tiny, almost ridiculous noise for something that felt like moving a weight from one hand to another. The ghost of the title stayed with me as I went back to Noah's inbox. On his screen, the age 40 email now wore 2 labels, memorial and family only. In the sidebar, the drafts folder showed a number that felt heavier than it should for a count of unsent sentences. Somewhere in there lay a draft titled Resignation Letter, version 3, don't send yet. Somewhere in there, my own job waited for its turn under the same light. I took a breath. placed my fingers on the trackpad, and clicked. The drafts folder opened like a filing cabinet drawer someone had stopped halfway through closing. Subject lines stacked on the screen. Budget projections. Family photos from last week. Things we should fix in Q3. The dates ran in a loose column down the side. Years of almost sent thoughts. Little pencil icons marked the ones he had been midway through editing when something, work, life, fear, pulled him away. Halfway down the list. There it was. Resignation letter. Version 3. Don't send yet. No addressee in the preview. No polite subject line to soften the blow. Just the raw label he had given it the night he saved. I clicked it open. The letter didn't explode when it appeared on the screen. It just sat there. A block of text in a familiar font. Waiting. He had started with, "To whom it may concern," then crossed it out in the next line and written, "Hi," plus his manager's name. As if even on his way out, he was still editing himself. The body of the email was careful and devastating. He thanked them for the opportunities. He acknowledged the stability, the benefits, the trust. Then, line by line, he described the feeling of being ground down, the back-to-back meetings that never resulted in anything concrete, the way his inbox filled with other people's emergencies before he had finished his first cup of coffee, the part where he wrote that the only time he felt useful anymore was when he made other people laugh in the break room. None of this was news in the sense of facts. We had both complained about work over cheap beer more times than I could count, but seeing it flattened into sentences with a cursor hovering at the end felt different. It made the exhaustion real in a way my memory had smoothed over. He ended the letter mid-paragraph. The last line read, "I don't want to wake up at 50 and realize I spent the last decade and then stopped." No full stop. No decision. The cursor blinked there, still waiting for a version of Noah that had never come back to finish the thought. I sat very still. The way you do when you're afraid a sudden movement might break something fragile in the room. Outside the window, a siren wailed and then faded. The radiator ticked as it adjusted to the cooling air. The lilies on the table had started to droop, their petals browning at the edges. My own boss would have been bewildered if I quit out of nowhere. She would say, "But you're doing so well. We rely on you." They always did. That was the problem. Noah had been relied on, too, right up until his heart stopped. A thought rose that I didn't like. Maybe neither of us had wanted to be the first one to say out loud that we were tired of the lives we had built. It was easier to meet for a drink, make each other laugh about our idiot colleagues, and then go back to our separate, parallel burnouts. The room felt close. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The wooden floor was cool under my feet as I crossed to the window. Outside, the streetlights had come on, throwing pale circles onto the wet pavement. A bus pulled up to the stop on the corner and exhaled a small crowd into the drizzle. People hunched their shoulders and checked their phones and moved on. For a moment I watched them. Strangers under umbrellas, each carrying a day they probably meant to talk about and didn't. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass. Laptop glow behind me like another window on another life. I pressed my palm lightly to the cold pane, then turned back to the table. I didn't draft my own resignation in response. Dramatic symmetry aside, I still needed to pay rent, and I wasn't ready to burn down my life on the strength of one unfinished email. I also didn't delete Noah's letter. It felt too much like erasing testimony. What I did do was click into the labels menu and create a new one. Do not show. It was a crude system, but it was a start. Under that label, I moved the resignation draft, the About That Night email, and the age 40 letter. Not because they were shameful, but because they were too complicated to drop into a slideshow between baby photos and graduation shots. His mother didn't need to read every detail of how close he had come to leaving his job. She didn't need to see him joke about me in an email to himself and then never tell me in person. Some pieces of Noah belonged in the quiet. Still, before I closed the window, I hit print. The printer in the corner woke up with a low whir and began feeding out pages. The sound pulled me back into my body in a way the scrolling hadn't. Each sheet landed on the tray with a small tap, physical proof of how close he had come to getting out. I gathered the pages and placed them face down on the table. The words turned away from the ceiling. The paper was warm against my fingers. Back on the screen, the system let me apply more than one label to each email. That felt right. People live in overlapping categories. Noah had been a son, a friend, a colleague, a man with a private terror of his own heart. There was no single folder he fit in. For the next while, I moved through the inbox like someone shelving books in a library that had blown apart. Short, silly notes to friends went into memorial. A forwarded meme about aging that we had traded back and forth got starred without a label at all, like a private joke I wasn't ready to share. Longer threads where he carried other people's burdens went into family only, unless they felt too intimate to be read by anyone else. Those went into do not show, not because they were shameful, but because the stories belonged to people who were still walking around in the world, sending new emails from accounts with their own passwords. Once, my cursor hovered over delete for a full minute. The email on the screen was an angry draft to an ex, full of heat and broken glass. He had never sent it. It didn't reveal anything we didn't already know from the ruins of that relationship, but it was ugly in a way that felt more like a wound than a truth. I imagined his mother reading it and flinching. I imagined the ex reading it and flinching in a completely different direction. Then I pictured Noah, alive, hand over the send button, choosing not to click. If he had kept those words in the dark while he was here, what gave me the right to drag them into daylight now? My finger moved. I didn't hit delete. I dragged the draft into a label I renamed delete and let it sit there, a limbo I could still back out of if the guilt changed shape overnight. The act of labeling, small as it was, nudged something loose. There were corners of my own life I had never let anyone see. Drafts, notebooks, nights where I had turned the conversation away from my own exhaustion and kept the joke going. For the first time, instead of feeling virtuous about my privacy, I wondered what it would look like if someone opened my inbox after I was gone. What patterns would they find? Which letters would they decide not to show my mother? A little jolt ran through me, like standing up too fast. I rolled my chair closer to the table and opened a new, blank email in my own account. The to field stayed empty for a long time. Eventually, I filled it in with my own address. Subject: if you're still here at 40. My hands shook a little more than I liked as I typed the first line. Hey, if you're reading this, you don't get to pretend you didn't see what Noah wrote. I didn't know yet whether I would schedule it, send it, or leave it in drafts as another kind of mirror. For once, the act of starting felt like more than a performance. On Noah's side of the screen, his resignation letter version 3 sat under a label I had invented to protect him. On mine, a version 0 of something waited to see if I would do more than talk about change. The banner on his account ticked down another few minutes. The memorial was still tomorrow. My own life, for the moment, was still here. I should have stopped at midnight. The lilies on the table had started to collapse in on themselves, leaving yellow pollen on the wood like crime scene dust. The laptop screen was the only bright thing in the room. Every now and then the heating clicked. A small metal sigh, like the building was changing its mind. In the corner of the browser, the timer slid under the 20-hour mark. I had moved a handful of emails into Memorial, a handful into Family Only, a handful into Do Not Show. It felt less like sorting and more like handling something radioactive with kitchen tongs. The drafts folder still showed a number that made my stomach tighten. One subject sat in the middle of the list, as if it had been waiting for me to run out of excuses. Draft, the thing about you, Emma. He hadn't capitalized my name. He never did in notes to himself. It made it look more casual than it felt. I told myself I would just flag it and move on. Tomorrow would be a long day. My eyes already felt as if they belonged to someone who'd slept in their contacts. I clicked. The draft opened in a small rectangle of white. The first line was so plain it didn't land until I read it twice. The thing about you is that you're always the one holding the stories, so nobody asks how you're actually doing. My hand went automatically to the mug next to the laptop. Cold. I took a sip anyway. He had written it like a list. That was so like him it hurt. You remember everyone's versions. You quote people back to themselves. You edit the sharp bits out of their anecdotes so they can keep telling them without bleeding. You do not, as a rule, let anyone see the raw file. I could hear him saying it, half amused, half something else. In my head, living room scenes, bar tables, video calls, me topping up glasses, filling silences, translating other people's disasters into neat, bearable arcs. Noah sitting across from me, letting the glow from my performance cover both of us. My thumb found the edge of the spacebar and pressed, just to have something to do. You do this for me too, the next line said. You have a whole set of Noah stories you tell. The funny ones. The smart ones. The he's such a good friend ones. I scrolled. I love those stories. I'm grateful for them. I'm also aware that none of them include the way my chest feels at 3 a.m. when I count my own heartbeats and lose count. The words blurred for a second. I blinked hard. He wasn't accusing. The tone stayed level, almost gentle. That was worse. I know you're tired. I know you're burning out at work and still showing up as the organized one. I know you schedule other people's rest and then forget to take your own. You keep everyone's versions safe. I don't know where you keep yours. I swallowed. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. On the table, the printed pages from his resignation letter and the age 40 email sat in a neat stack, face down. A little paper hill of things I had already decided to keep. On the screen, Noah kept going. If you ever read this, I don't want you to feel like I'm scolding you. This is just me putting on record that I see you doing this, that I've been hiding behind it. The cursor blinked after the last sentence. No sign-off. No question. Just that. I sat there with my hand over my mouth, as if I could keep the words from getting all the way in. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocked. A car passed outside, tires hissing on wet road. The sounds made everything on the screen feel more solid, not less. He had been right. I thought about the way I had handled the memorial slideshow earlier that afternoon, on autopilot, cropping photos, balancing work shots with baby pictures, emailing the file to his sister with a cheerful, "This looks great. Don't worry about the tech." No mention of the pile of drafts I had already seen. No mention of the fact that I was shaking when I typed. I had held everyone else's stories so tightly that I hadn't left my own any oxygen. The timer in the corner ticked down another minute. The motion tugged at the edge of my vision. 20 hours and some change until the account shifted into whatever memorial status meant. Plenty of time and no time at all. I scrolled to the bottom of the draft again. Read the last line out loud, just to hear it in the room. I see you doing this. My voice sounded strange, like it belonged on a recording. I could drop this email into Memorial and let everyone know he had seen me more clearly than I had realized. I could mark it family only and hand his perception of me to people who barely knew our shorthand. I could tuck it into Do Not Show and pretend that was an act of humility instead of avoidance. Or I could delete it. The delete icon hovered in the corner of the window, small and easy. If I deleted it, there would be no record that he had written these words. No future version of me could open this file and be confronted with the fact that I had been seen and still chosen to stay edited. The thought made something in my chest flare, brief and scared. I closed my eyes and pictured the memorial room. The folding chairs, the catered sandwiches, the slideshow on a loop, the safe stories, polished and passed around like plates. I would probably tell some of them myself. But somewhere, behind all of that, I wanted there to be at least one record where we hadn't tidied everything. I opened my eyes. Instead of hitting delete, I moved the cursor to the labels menu. Memorial. Family only. Do not show. Delete. My finger hovered, then clicked. Do not show. It felt like a compromise and a promise at the same time. This wasn't for the room. This was for me. A small, private file that said, "You were not as invisible as you thought." Before I closed the window, I selected the text and copied it into a new email in my own account. To me. Subject line blank. I didn't schedule it. Not yet. I just saved it to drafts and watched the little confirmation pop up in the corner of my screen. Saved to drafts. On Noah's side, the original stayed under Do Not Show, where the auto-delete rules might or might not touch it. On mine, a copy sat in an inbox that would, presumably, outlive the timer on his. The banner at the top of his account flickered as if refreshing itself. This account will be converted to memorial status in 19 hours, 47 minutes, 23 seconds. The seconds rolled on. I pushed the chair back and stood up. My legs prickled, the way they do when you've been still too long. In the kitchen, I ran the tap until the water turned cold and splashed some on my face. The mirror over the sink showed a woman with puffy eyes and funeral makeup rubbed thin at the edges. I looked older than I had in the photos we'd picked for the slideshow. Older and more in focus. Okay, I told my reflection, "You're in this too," back at the table. I picked up a clean envelope and slid the printed pages inside. The lighter part of the age 40 email. A joke about learning his mother's soup. A printout of a meme he'd sent me a month before he died. Pieces I could imagine reading aloud without making the room collapse. On the front, I wrote for tomorrow in shaky letters. Another envelope sat beside it. Empty for now. Its flap waited. Family only, I thought. Maybe. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know yet what I would say on the microphone, or how much of the heavy version of Noah I would let leak into the polished one. But for the first time since opening his inbox, I felt less like a technician and more like a person in the story. The timer ticked under 19.5 hours. I closed the laptop, leaving his account signed in but the screen dark. The apartment fell back into the softer hum of fridge, radiator, distant traffic. In the silence, I could hear the faint, mechanical echo of the printer from earlier, the sound of unsent words turning into something you could hold. Tomorrow, I would have to decide which ones to hand over. Tonight, I let myself sit in the middle of it, not editing, not fixing, just feeling the weight. The lilies wilted quietly on the table. We weren't done. The memorial venue smelled like coffee, wax, and the kind of cologne people put on when they don't know what else to do. Someone had tried to make the multi-purpose room look less like a conference space. There were fairy lights around the windows, a table of pastries, a slideshow looping on the far wall. In the photos, Noah grinned at cameras, held babies, wore 3 different terrible Christmas sweaters. Every few seconds, the projector fan sighed. Chairs scraped as people found seats. Low voices knitted together into a hush. I stood near the back with the envelope in my hands, the one I'd labelled for tomorrow the night before. Inside were the excerpts I'd chosen, the line where he thanked his future self for staying, a joke about booking a checkup before the next ice age, a short paragraph about calling his mother on Sundays. The heavier pages, the nights of counting heartbeats, the unfinished resignation, the thing about you, Emma, were at home in a drawer, under a stack of utility bills. Do Not Show had become literal. On my phone, an unread notification sat at the top of the screen. Subject: Update on account status. I didn't open it. I already knew what it would say. Sometime between brushing my teeth and finding a parking spot. The timer had run to 0. The server had done what servers do. Convert. Archive. Auto-delete certain content. For now, I wanted to hold the analog version. His mother spotted me and made a small beeline through the crowd. Her black dress didn't quite fit right at the shoulders. Like it belonged to an event she hadn't agreed to attend, Emma, she said, squeezing my arm. Thank you for everything. Her eyes flicked to the envelope. Is that? She began. Some of his words. I said, just the parts that felt right for today. She swallowed and nodded. Relief and fear crossed her face in the same second. I'm glad you're the one doing this, she said. I wouldn't know where to start. I almost told her about the labels. Memorial. Family only. Do not show. Delete. The small, shaky empire of categories I'd built overnight. Instead, I just squeezed back. Neither did I said, but I started. The officiant called everyone to sit. The room rustled and settled. The slideshow faded into the first blank slide with Noah's name. His dates. A quote he'd never actually said but would have liked. People spoke. His manager read a careful paragraph about Noah's contributions at work. His sister told a story about him teaching her how to ride a bike, pretending not to notice when she crashed into the hedge. A friend from college talked about the time they'd slept on a train platform in a foreign city, laughing at how broke they were. The stories were good. They were true, as far as they went. They stayed in the safe lanes. Funny, kind, smart, loyal. When it was my turn, the officiant nodded toward me. My legs carried me to the front before my brain caught up. The microphone smelled faintly of disinfectant. For a second, all I could hear was my own breath in the sound system, louder than it had any right to be. I set the envelope on the lectern, slid one page out. Hi, I said. I'm Emma. Most of you know that. If you don't, I'm one of Noah's longtime friends. The one who always reminded him to eat something green. A small, tired laugh rippled through the room. It steadied my hands. I've been helping his family go through some of his digital stuff, I said. Emails. Notes. It turns out Noah left himself a lot of messages. I paused. He wrote one for his 40th birthday. I went on. He didn't get to read it. But there's a piece of it I think he wouldn't mind sharing. I read the paragraph I'd moved into Memorial last night. The part where he thanked his future self for staying. The line about hoping he'd taken a week off without answering emails. The hope that he'd told the people in his life something real once in a while, instead of just making them laugh. As I spoke, I heard small sounds from the chairs. A sniff, an exhale, someone's bracelet clinking against their coffee cup. I didn't read the part about his father's age. I didn't read the nights of counting heartbeats. Those belonged to him, and, maybe later, to his family in a smaller room. This isn't how he imagined turning 40, I said, my throat tight. But even now, he somehow managed to give us homework. A few people smiled. Call your doctor, I said, echoing his words. Take a week. Tell someone something real. I looked at his mother. Her eyes shone. And for those of us who loved him, I added, maybe we can stop telling the version of Noah that only ever makes the room lighter. He was that. He was also scared sometimes. He tried. He almost booked the appointment. He almost sent the email. That doesn't make him weaker. It makes him human. The sentence hung there, riskier than the safe stories. The room didn't collapse. No one stood up and walked out. A few people nodded. Slowly, there are parts of his inbox we're not going to share, I said, on purpose. Not because they're bad, but because they were written in a voice he didn't use in public. Those versions deserve some privacy. I thought of the "Do Not Show" label. The drafts breathing quietly in that folder. The thing about you, Emma echoed at the back of my mind. But I wanted you to know that they exist. I finished. He was more than the anecdotes. We all are. I folded the page and slipped it back into the envelope. The microphone hummed softly as I stepped away. Back in my seat, my hands shook enough that I had to grip the program with both of them to keep it from rattling. The rest of the service blurred. Another song. Another story. A closing prayer I didn't really hear. Afterward, people milled around the coffee urns. Plates clinked. Someone turned the music up just enough to blur the edges of conversations. Noah's mother found me again. The envelope now clutched in her fingers. Thank you, she said, for how you said it. Her gaze dropped to the flap. Are there more? She asked. Hesitant. Yes, I said. Some about work. Some about how he felt. Sometimes I didn't mention the one about me. That felt like a separate conversation. I can put together a small pack for you, I offered. Just the pieces that feel like they might help. You can decide when or if you want to read them. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction at the word. If I would like that, she said. Not right away. But someday I'll make sure they're printed, I said. Paper. Not just links, thank you, she whispered. On the drive home, my phone buzzed twice on the passenger seat. At a red light. I checked. The first notification was from his email provider. This account has been converted to memorial status. Certain content has been archived or deleted in accordance with our policy. The language was as bloodless as the banner had been. The second notification was from my own account. Draft saved. If you're still here at 40, I had scheduled it that morning, on a jitter of courage, between choosing shoes and finding my keys. 5 years from now, on a Tuesday, an email from past Emma would land in my inbox, whether I felt ready or not. For once, I hadn't left it at someday at home. The flat felt different, as if the furniture had moved half a centimetre to the left while I was gone. I put the memorial envelope on the table and pulled open the drawer where I'd hidden the other stack. The words he'd written and never sent stared up at me from their face-down pages. Age 40. Resignation letter. About that night. The thing about you, Emma. I added a fresh sheet on top. In my own handwriting this time. For family. Later. If wanted. Underneath, in smaller letters, I wrote, he was funny. He was kind. He was also scared and trying. Please only read when you're ready to hold all of that at once. I slid the note into the stack and closed the drawer. The laptop on the table woke up when I brushed it. My own inbox glowed on the screen. The scheduled email sat in the scheduled folder, its little future send time set. My cursor hovered over it for a long moment. Cancel send. Reschedule. Leave it. I left it. In the quiet, I could hear the fridge, the distant elevator, the faint, remembered tapping of printer pages from last night, the building's sounds, my own breathing. For years, I had edited other people's stories so they would go down easier. Noah had left me with a different job: carry the whole version. The funny parts, the scared parts, the almosts, and, inconveniently, start doing the same for myself. I closed the laptop. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, a neighbor turned on their television. The city kept going. On the table, next to the Wilting Lilies, my phone buzzed one more time with a calendar alert I had forgotten to cancel. Call Mum. I stared at it for a second. Then I picked up the phone and, for once, didn't swipe it away. "Hi," I said when she answered. "I just came from a memorial. I have a favor to ask." "What kind of favor?" she said, wary and curious. "Can we talk?" I said, "about something real for a minute." Her silence on the line was the kind that included years. "Of course," she said at last. The conversation that followed wasn't neat. It didn't fix anything. But it existed. In real time. In our actual voices. Before any of us had the chance to turn it into a story. When we hung up, I sat there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the apartment. No timer. No banner. Just the slow, ordinary ticking of everything that was still here. Noah's account had turned into a memorial. Mine, for now, was still live. It felt like a deadline I didn't want to miss again. By the time the lilies from the memorial started to fall apart, I opened Noah's inbox again. They sat on my kitchen table in a cheap glass vase, petals loosening in slow motion. Yellow dust gathered in a ring on the wood, like the outline of something that had been there and left. The room smelled like old flowers and coffee grounds. It had been a few days since the service. Long enough for the trays of food to be finished, for the sympathy texts to slow down, for everyone's lives to start knitting themselves back together around the hole where Noah used to be. Mine hadn't found their new shape yet. The laptop woke with a soft chime. One click. Password. Another click. And there it was, the black ribbon banner across the top of the screen. This account has been converted to memorial status. No more new messages. No more outgoing mail. Just folders and settings and a link that invited friends and family to share memories. The same inbox I had spent a night inside, now frozen in a different costume. I was only there to make sure I hadn't missed anything important for his family. At least, that was the version that sounded practical enough to pass. For a while I just sat, watching the cursor hover over the folder list. Memorial. Family only. Do not show. Delete. My own labels stared back at me from the sidebar, still small and neutral, as if the system didn't quite know what to make of them either. Then my eye caught the tiny, greyed-out number next to another word. Scheduled. Most of those messages had already done whatever they were programmed to do. The posthumous note to Jonah. The age 40 pep talk that never reached its target. Little time bombs he'd buried for himself in the future. One subject line sat further down the list. Its send date years ahead of where the timer had stopped. If you're still here at 45. I'd seen it before. On that first long night. And backed away like I'd touched a hot pan. Too far ahead. Too close to the part of my own life I still thought of as later now. With the lilies collapsing behind me and the memorial already folded into the past. It felt less theoretical. I clicked. The email opened in a white box. Same as all the others. Same font. Same blinking cursor at the end of a paragraph. He'd actually finished this time. He wrote to himself in second person, like he was half pep-talking, half daring future Noah to look him in the eye. He ticked through small, ordinary hopes. A better desk chair. Fewer nights of waking up, sure his heart had skipped a beat. Weekends where he didn't just check his work inbox for 3 hours. No grand gestures. No by 45 you should have list that a social feed could turn into a graphic. Just a handful of quiet things that told me exactly how tired he'd been of living on the edge of his own life. Near the end, one line stuck like a piece of shell in my throat. If you're still here at 45, it means you got more time than Dad. Don't spend it living in drafts. The room went very still. Outside, a bus passed on the hill. Low engine hum, climbing, then fading. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The laptop fan breathed quietly. The way it had the night I dragged his words into folders and tried to decide which versions of him the world could carry. My own age floated up in my mind like a number in a train window. Not 45 yet. Close enough that I could see it from here. I thought of the email I'd scheduled to myself after the memorial. If you're still here at 40, sitting in my own scheduled folder like a small flare fired into the future. I'd written it quickly, on the edge of a phone call with my mother. Heart still raw from hearing my own voice read his words into a room of people. This felt different. Less adrenaline, more accounting. I read Noah's line again. Don't spend it living in drafts. I knew what living in drafts looked like. It looked like unsent resignation letters, unfinished essays, messages to friends I typed in the notes app and never moved into the actual chat. It looked like being the person who organized everyone else's deadlines and never treated her own like they were real. I closed his email window before I could fall down the rabbit hole of reading it a third, fourth, fifth time, and flipped over to my own inbox. The contrast was jarring. Color. Notifications. A little red badge on a shopping newsletter I hadn't bothered to unsubscribe from. At the bottom of the sidebar, the scheduled folder glowed with a modest one. I clicked. There it was. If you're still here at 40. Send date already locked in. 5 years would pass, and one morning my own words would arrive, like a stranger at the door. I hovered over the options. Cancel send. Reschedule. Edit. For a second, the temptation was real. I could soften it. Make it less direct. Turn it into something inspirational and harmless. My finger moved away from the trackpad. Instead, I opened a new email. To myself. Subject. If you're still here at 45. The words looked different under my name than they had under his. Less like a warning, more like a question I didn't want to dodge. I didn't try to match his tone. I didn't mention his father, or hospitals, or numbers on heart monitors I'd never seen. Those belonged to his story. I kept mine smaller, closer. I wrote that if I was still here at 45, I hoped I wasn't answering work emails in bed, that I'd left any job that needed me to apologize for existing more than it needed me to do my actual work, that I was calling my mother on Sundays even when I didn't have good news, and letting my friends see me on the days when I wasn't the organized one. I wrote that I wanted fewer conversations that lived inside screens and more that happened in rooms where someone could pass me a glass of water when I ran out of words. Then I added one more line, simple enough that future me couldn't pretend she didn't understand it. Please don't spend the extra years living only in other people's inboxes. I read the email back once, checking for the parts that sounded like performance and cutting them. No quotable sentences. No fake wisdom. Just a handful of things I didn't want to keep postponing until it was someone else at the front of a room with a slideshow. When it felt honest, I clicked the little clock icon beside the send button. The date picker opened, full of tidy boxes marching off into years I hadn't thought much about. Scroll. Click. Confirm. 5 years after the 40 email. Another Tuesday. The system blinked its little confirmation message. Message scheduled. Now my scheduled folder showed two small anchors thrown into water I hadn't sailed yet. For a moment I just watched them sit there. Identical. Except for the numbers in their subjects. Then I closed my inbox and, for the last time, went back to Noah's. The memorial banner still sat across the top, the black ribbon neat and impersonal. Under it, all of my improvised labels lined the sidebar like the spines of books in a library that had finally stopped taking returns. I didn't open any more emails. I didn't reread the thing about you, Emma, or the almost angry drafts, or the jokes he'd half-typed and abandoned. I just looked at the folders. Memorial. Family only. Do not show. Delete. There was comfort, I realized, in the fact that I would never get this completely right. Some things I'd protected that maybe should have been shared. Some I'd shared that maybe should have stayed between him and the blinking cursor. But the work was done. For now. The account was no longer a room I was living in. It was a place I could visit when I wanted to remember that a person is always more than the version you see in public. I logged out. The screen slipped back to my own sign-in page. Name. Password. 2 little dots in the corner for new mail. My inbox was still live. Messy. Overfull. Full of promises I'd made and ones I was still avoiding. Somewhere inside it, 2 future emails waited, patient and blind to everything that would happen between now and the days they were due. Behind me, one of the lilies finally let go. A petal dropped to the table with a sound so soft it barely qualified as a sound at all. I picked up the vase, carried it to the sink, and tipped some of the yellow water away. Fresh water ran cold over my fingers. The stems shifted, a little less burdened by their own weight. They were still going to die. That wasn't the point. I brought them back to the table anyway. Outside, traffic moved steadily up and down the hill. Somewhere, a neighbor's radio changed songs. In the distance, a siren started and faded, swallowed by the ordinary noise of a city where people were still sending and receiving messages, answering calls, promising each other. Soon, I sat down, looked at the quiet laptop, and let the thought land without flinching. Noah's story had stopped in the middle of a sentence he thought he'd get to finish. Mine, inconveniently, hadn't. For the first time in a long time, that felt less like a threat and more like a draft I was finally willing